In over a century of documented interactions between wild killer whales and humans in the water, no wild orca has ever killed a human being. Not one. There are records going back to the early 20th century of orcas encountering swimmers, divers, surfers, and sailors who had fallen overboard, sometimes in the same waters where the same orcas were actively hunting seals and sea lions. And in every documented case, the orca left the human alone. There are accounts of orcas approaching overturned boats and circling the survivors in the water without making any contact. There are records of orcas surfacing within meters of surfers in waters where they were actively hunting sea lions of comparable size. The orcas looked and moved on. This is not because orcas are incapable of killing a human. A mature male orca is 7 to 8 meters long, weighs up to 6 tons, swims at speeds above 50 kilometers per hour, and coordinates hunting strategies with its pod that involves sophisticated communication and division of roles. Orcas in the Antarctic flip sea ice floes to knock resting Weddell seals into the water. Orcas in the Pacific harass and drown blue whales, the largest animals that have ever lived on Earth. Orcas in the Eastern Pacific regularly kill great white sharks, typically by flipping them upside down to induce tonic immobility, holding them there until they suffocate, then eating the liver. A human swimmer represents, by any objective measure, a far easier target than any of these. The question is not whether orcas could kill humans. The question is why they consistently choose not to, across every population, every ocean, and every documented encounter in recorded history. The genome has started to answer that question, and the answer is not the one most people expect. It is not about friendliness, or about orcas recognizing humans as fellow intelligent beings, or about some general rule in orca behavior against attacking primates. The answer is about culture, specifically about how prey traditions are transmitted through orcapods across generations, how those traditions have driven genetic divergence between orca populations over thousands of years, and how the genome has encoded not just the brain capable of cultural learning, but the social structures that make that learning the central organizing principle of orca life. Orcas do not kill humans in the wild because humans are not part of any wild orca's prey tradition, and prey traditions in orcas are not learned from trial and error, but inherited from mothers and grandmothers who pass them down through a system of cultural transmission that the genome has specifically evolved to support. Understanding this requires looking at the orca not just as an individual animal, but as a node in a cultural network. An animal whose behavior is as much a product of what it has been taught as of what it was born with, and whose genome has been shaped by thousands of years of interaction between genetics and culture in a feedback loop that has no real parallel outside of humans. The orca genome was sequenced and published in a landmark 2016 study by Andrew Foote and colleagues in Nature Communications. The paper's title, Genome Culture Coevolution Promotes Rapid Divergence of Killer Whale Ecotypes, captures exactly what the study found: that culture and genome have been evolving together in orcas, each driving change in the other, and that this coevolution has produced genetically distinct populations whose differences at the DNA level directly reflect differences in their cultural traditions. The analysis compared the genomes of killer whales from the three main ecotypes in the North Pacific: resident orcas, which eat only fish and have never been recorded taking a mammal; transient orcas, also called Biggs killer whales, which eat only marine mammals and have never been recorded eating fish; and offshore orcas, which eat primarily sharks and large fish. Despite living in overlapping geographic ranges and having no physical barrier preventing them from interbreeding, these three ecotypes have been diverging genetically for thousands of years. They rarely interbreed. Their dialects, the complex vocalizations that are themselves culturally transmitted, are mutually unintelligible. Residents and transients can be in the same bay at the same time and will not interact. Researchers studying the two ecotypes initially thought they might be different species before genetic analysis revealed that the divergence, while real and measurable, had not yet reached the level of speciation, though some scientists argue it is heading there. Their genomes now carry signals of selection at specific genes related to digestion, immune function, and sensory processing that correspond directly to their dietary specializations. The transient orca genome shows signatures of selection at genes involved in processing lipid-rich marine mammal blubber. The resident orca genome shows signatures at genes involved in metabolizing the different fat compositions found in fish. These are not behavioral differences that happen to have genomic correlates. They are genomic differences that resulted from thousands of years of cultural commitment to a dietary tradition that shaped which genetic variants were advantageous. Orcas that came from a fish-eating pod and happened to carry genes better suited to fish digestion did better, surviving longer and producing more offspring, passing on both the cultural tradition and the favorable alleles simultaneously. Orcas that came from a mammal-eating pod and happened to carry genes better suited to blubber digestion did better, for the same compounding reason. Over enough generations, the two populations diverged not just culturally, but genetically, pulled apart by a cultural tradition that was itself heritable, not through genes, but through learning. The genome tracked the culture. The culture wrote itself into the genome. This is genome-culture coevolution, a process most often discussed in the context of human evolution, the classic example being the spread of lactase persistence genes in populations that adopted dairying, but now documented in another highly social, culturally sophisticated mammal whose traditions have been stable enough over long enough time periods to leave measurable marks in its DNA. This is what makes the absence of human predation by wild orcas so well explained by the genomic data. Transient orcas eat marine mammals. They are entirely comfortable killing warm-blooded prey in the water. They have the size, the speed, the coordination, and the cognitive capacity to kill a human swimmer without difficulty. They demonstrate this capacity constantly on seals, porpoises, and minke whales. But the prey tradition of every transient pod is specific. It is learned from the mother, refined through experience with the pod, and passed to offspring. It specifies the types of prey, the hunting techniques appropriate to each type, and the communication signals used during hunts. Different transient pods have documented specializations. Some focus on harbor seals, others on Dahl's porpoise, others on sea otters. The tradition is not generic eat marine mammals, but a detailed, culturally transmitted specification of which prey, how to catch it, how to divide it, and what calls to make during the hunt. Humans are not in that tradition. No living wild orca has ever learned from its mother that humans are prey, because no orca mother in the accessible historical record has hunted humans. And because orca culture is conservative, pods maintain their traditions with extraordinary fidelity across generations. The absence of humans from the prey tradition is self-perpetuating. A transient orca encountering a human swimmer does not experience an unfamiliar potential prey item and decide on reflection not to eat it. It experiences something outside the category of prey entirely, because its culture has defined the category of prey and humans are not in it. The genome also reveals why orca culture is so stable and so important to individual orca survival. Orcas are one of only a handful of species on Earth that go through menopause, the permanent cessation of reproduction well before the end of the female's natural lifespan. In most animals, Females reproduce until they die, or until they become too old to successfully raise young. Orca females stop reproducing in their 30s or 40s, but continue living into their 80s and 90s, spending the last 40 to 50 years of their lives as non-reproducing members of their pods. This is an extraordinary allocation of biological resources. A post-reproductive female consumes food, occupies social space, and requires protection from environmental threats, all without contributing offspring. For this arrangement to be favored by natural selection, the benefits she provides must outweigh these costs substantially. A 2012 study by Darren Croft, Daniel Franks, and colleagues, published in Science, analyzed over 3 decades of behavioral data from resident killer whale populations in the Pacific Northwest, and found that the presence of a post-reproductive female in a pod significantly increased the survival of that pod's calves and juveniles, particularly during years when salmon, the resident orca's primary prey, was scarce. During El Niño years and other periods of low food availability, pods with living post-reproductive grandmothers had markedly higher juvenile survival rates than pods that had lost their oldest females. The older female was acting as a guide, using her decades of accumulated knowledge about prey location, historical migration routes, and resource patches she had visited in previous scarcity events to lead her pod to food when younger members had no way of knowing where to look. She was a living library of ecological and cultural knowledge, and the pod's survival in difficult years depended on her being present. The genomic implications of this are significant. Menopause in orcas, like menopause in humans, pilot whales, beluga whales, narwhals, and a small number of other species, appears to be an evolutionary adaptation rather than an accident of longevity or an artifact of captive extended lifespan. The genes associated with reproductive lifespan have been under selection in the orca lineage in a direction that favors earlier cessation of reproduction and longer post-reproductive survival, presumably because the fitness benefit of having a knowledgeable grandmother alive and available to the pod outweighs the fitness cost of losing her reproductive output. The grandmother is worth more to the pod's genes as a cultural repository than as a reproducing female. A 2015 study by Lauren Brent and colleagues, published in Current Biology, extended this finding by showing that post-reproductive females specifically led their pods to food during difficult years, and that their leadership was most valuable during El Niño events when salmon availability collapsed. Exactly the scenarios where decades of ecological memory would matter most. The oldest females led because they had survived the most previous crises and remembered where food was found during the last one. This means that the cultural system itself, the system of transmitted knowledge that includes prey traditions, vocal dialects, foraging strategies, and crisis responses, has been under positive genomic selection. The genome did not just enable culture, it invested in culture, extending the lifespan of its most experienced carriers because the knowledge they held was worth more to the pod's survival than additional offspring would have been. The contrast between wild orca behavior and captive orca behavior illuminates what happens when this cultural system is disrupted. In captivity, orcas have killed human trainers on multiple occasions. 4 fatalities documented across multiple facilities, most famously the 2010 death of SeaWorld trainer Dawn Brancho in Orlando. Wild orcas have never killed a human. The difference is not genetic. Captive orcas are not genetically different from wild orcas in any meaningful way. The difference is cultural. Captive orcas are captured or born into environments where the entire social architecture that organizes wild orca life is absent. They are separated from their mothers and grandmothers, the primary transmitters of prey tradition and behavioral norms. They are housed with orcas from different ecotypes and different populations whose dialects they cannot understand, producing social isolation even within a group. They are deprived of the foraging behaviors, the searching, the coordinated hunting, the prey assessment that occupy the majority of a wild orca's cognitive and physical energy every day. They are fed from buckets by humans, which inverts the normal predator-prey relationship in a way that has no analog in wild orca experience. In this environment, the cultural framework that defines acceptable interactions has broken down, and orcas have nothing to guide their behavior toward humans except the immediate context of confinement, frustration, and the absence of any transmitted norm. The prey tradition inhibition that keeps wild orcas from treating humans as food does not come from the genome directly. It comes from culture, which the genome created the capacity to sustain. Remove the culture, and there is nothing for the genome's cultural capacity to operate on. In 2020, reports began emerging of orcas in the Strait of Gibraltar and along the Atlantic coast of Spain and Portugal, interacting with sailing boats in ways that damaged rudders and in some cases caused vessels to sink. By 2023, the incidents had numbered in the hundreds and had attracted worldwide media coverage, with the animals being described variously as attacking boats, seeking revenge on humans, and exhibiting coordinated aggressive behavior. Several headlines suggested the orcas were rising up or retaliating for years of human mistreatment of the ocean. The genomic and behavioral evidence tells a more grounded story. The interactions are concentrated among a small number of juvenile and subadult individuals belonging to the Iberian orca subpopulation, a critically endangered group of fewer than 40 individuals that has been studied for decades. The behavior appears to have started with a single female, designated Gladys White, or White Gladys, who began interacting with boat rudders, possibly after a traumatic encounter with a vessel, possibly out of play or curiosity, and then spread through a subset of the local population through direct observation and social learning. Younger orcas watched the behavior, found it engaging, and adopted it. Within 2 years, it had spread to multiple individuals who had not been present during the original incidents. It spread horizontally through a peer group, the way novel behaviors spread through orca pods when they produce a response that is rewarding or simply interesting to animals with high social curiosity and strong imitative capacity. It is cultural transmission of a new behavior in real time, exactly the mechanism the genome evolved to support, operating on a timescale short enough for researchers to document year by year. The Gibraltar incidents did not result in any orca killing or eating a human, despite ample opportunity. Boats were sunk. Humans ended up in the water within meters of the orcas. The orcas did not pursue them. In every documented case, the orcas disengaged when the vessel was incapacitated or when they had finished their interaction with the rudder, and the humans in the water were ignored entirely. The behavior is about the boats, specifically about the rudder, which the orcas have learned is satisfying to spin, push, or break off, and not about the humans aboard them. The humans are incidental to the learned behavior and outside the prey framework entirely, even in a population that has adopted a novel and disruptive interaction with human technology. This is entirely consistent with the prey tradition model and with the genomic picture of orca culture as a powerful constraint on behavior. The novel behavior is boat-rudder interaction, transmitted culturally as a social behavior. It is not predation. The genomic architecture that encodes orca culture, the extended post-reproductive lifespan, the matrilineal transmission of behavior, the capacity for vocal and behavioral imitation that underlies pod dialects, produced both the prey tradition inhibition that has kept every wild orca from killing a human, and the Gibraltar rudder behavior that has alarmed sailors across 2,000 kilometers of Atlantic coastline. Both are outputs of the same cultural learning system, encoded in and maintained by the same genome. The complete answer to why the ocean's deadliest predator refuses to kill us is therefore not a single fact, but a system. The orca genome evolved a brain capable of complex social learning, a brain with a large neocortex, extensive paralimbic lobe development associated with social and emotional processing in cetaceans, and a capacity for vocal imitation and cultural transmission that places orcas alongside humans, elephants, and a small number of other species as genuine cultural animals. That brain enabled the development of cultural traditions, including prey traditions, that are transmitted from mother to offspring across generations with extraordinary fidelity, and that define an orca's identity as much as its biology does. Those prey traditions have been stable enough over thousands of years to drive genetic divergence between ecotypes, writing the cultural commitment to specific prey types into the genome through natural selection on digestion, metabolism, and sensory processing until the ecotypes are no longer just behaviorally distinct, but measurably, genomically distinct. The system is maintained by the grandmother effect. Post-reproductive females whose longevity the genome specifically supports because their cultural knowledge is worth more to the pod than additional offspring. And the entire structure produces, as one of its outputs, the consistent exclusion of humans from the prey category of every wild orca pod on Earth, maintained not by any single gene or any single behavioral rule, but by a cultural tradition that no living orca learned to violate because no orca before them did either. Humans are safe in the water with wild orcas, not because orcas are gentle, and not because they are making some conscious moral decision to spare us. We are safe because we are outside the category that their culture and the genome that built, encoded, and maintains that culture across generations has defined as prey. The genome does not make the decision. It builds the system that makes the decision for every orca that has ever lived. Subscribe. New discoveries about lost species posted every few days.